Brilliant. Okay, so we welcome you all to the BSc Historical Crim Winter Seminar Series, Meet the Authors. The series welcomes presentations from research in progress, research completed, and research published. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Emma Watkins. Emma is currently a lecturer in criminology at the University of Birmingham. Her research is, Emma is a historical criminology who uses digital technologies with historical documentation and criminological methodologies. She's an elected member of the Royal Historical Society. And just a little bit about Emma's work. She's beginning a new historical crim project, which will explore the first government-run youth institutions in England and Wales, the reformatory schools. This research will explore the narratives of justification regarding physical force from a historical perspective. Since children have been imprisoned, they have been mistreated and abused. How was mistreatment justified, criticized, ignored within these historical institutions and within the wider context of the political public domain? So these are this is a key question to Emma's work. Today's presentation is titled "The Criminalisation and Control of the Poor: A Look at 19th-Century Tasmanian Pauper-Emancipists." Before we go any further, there's a discussion, a little blurb on the code of conduct. I would like you to understand or take the opportunity to for self-awareness in how we treat this space. The aim is to establish a safe space for intellectual exchange, as always. So please be mindful and treat each other with respect and dignity as a starting point for inclusivity. Also, another important point is that the aim for these sessions is to be interactive. So while Emma will speak, will give her presentation, we'll have an opportunity at the end to ask questions or interact in a number of ways. So you can feel free to use the hand raise function. Feel free to write your questions in the chat. I know sometimes this is a preference for many because it overcomes the need to ad lib your question. It gives you time to think as you formulate what you want to say. So at the end of her presentation, Emma will address these questions or these thoughts. It need not be a question, just a comment. Also, this is an opportunity. I very much like to map why people join these sessions. Are you here because you want to find ways to integrate history into the classroom? Is this part of your research process, method or methodology, or a combination? Also, I really like knowing where people are tuning in from, just to get a sense of how the far reach of the reach rather of the network. So yes, without further ado, I will pass the floor over to Emma and have her take up space.
Thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. I'll just get my PowerPoint on. Right, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint now with the white screen. Thanks. So thank you for the introduction. I referred to my reformatory work there in the introduction, and that is something that I am just starting at the moment. So very much a work in progress or work in starting. And the work I'm going to present today is more a work in progress. I'm bringing together my findings and kind of thinking through the connections. And so that's why this is a really good opportunity to kind of present this, because any thoughts, questions, things you think I should think more about, advice, I will take it on readily. So I'm looking at the criminalisation and control of the poor, particularly looking at 19th century Tasmanian Pauper-Emancipists. So I've been studying the lives of Pauper-Emancipists, and they are those who were transported to Tasmania, formerly known as Van Diemen's Land in Australia, as part of the British convict transportation system. And they were also, that's the kind of starting sample. And then within that sample of those who were transported to Van Diemen's Land, I've chosen those who were reinstitutionalized after they were set free from servitude, reinstitutionalized within the charitable system, similar to the workhouses back here in the UK, where they died. So what I essentially did was trace them back through their lives from death, so grave to cradle, as it were, exploring their lives and punishment, their social and economic lives, their interactions with authorities, institutions, and their health. So essentially anything I could find on them within the records that were available. So this part of my research has explored the penal and welfare provision of colonial Australia with a specific focus on Van Diemen's Land. And there has, of course, been a long argument that poor relief and penal confinement emerge linked together as existing arguments. And while my wider research has explored the penalisation of the charitable system itself, the focus of this presentation will be the criminalisation of poverty. And I will touch a little bit on the charitable system, but most of it will be focused on the criminalisation of poverty of this particular group. In both cases, though, it's all about the kind of punitive containment being used to relieve society of their poor, and that's the kind of overarching argument. And this issue is important because attention on the issue of begging and homelessness rarely remains outside of public debate for very long. And I'm sure that you can all kind of know what this photo here is referring to just by seeing the tents next to Braverman. So recently, Braverman described being homeless as a lifestyle choice and proposed a civil offence to restrict the use of tents in regards to homeless people. And indeed, the Vagrancy Act in the UK had its 200-year anniversary this year in 2024. To date, despite campaigning, it has not yet been fully repealed. And some of the worst parts of it, there's been mooted that it will be added to the criminal justice bill. So there've been some steps forward thanks to campaigning, but just as many backwards as well. And there is a similar story in Australia as well. So the number of homelessness in Australia on census night was 1 in 200 people. Those homeless in Australia are similarly vulnerable to criminalisation because of their undesirable presence in public spaces. And it is all about that kind of visibility. The visibly homeless are subjected to high levels of surveillance and policing. Criminal law enforcement practices, including such things as searches, move-on directions, on-spot fines, remand detention, court-imposed punishment, all of those kind of measures continue to be used on this vulnerable population. And the way that homelessness is currently dealt with in Australia in these terms stems from Victorian attitudes and laws towards begging and vagrancy. It is often the visibility of homelessness that is really of concern, not homelessness itself, meaning it is not those who are considered socially disruptive that are or rather it is those who are considered socially disruptive that are dragged within the criminal justice system. So, for example, being homeless is not an offence, but the activities related to being homeless are targeted under the law, such as begging. So a criminal offence can result indirectly from these behaviours. So such narratives as these would be familiar with those in the 19th century. And certainly, as well as concern over the visibility of homelessness and visibility of poverty, both 19th century and contemporary views also centered on the idea that they should be grateful and are undeserving of agency and should accept whatever support is given to them without having any kind of agency or choice within that. So there's familiar themes then from the 19th century and today. So this research into pauper-emancipists uses collective biographies to uncover underlying factors influencing the individual lives. So this has been done by bringing together civil records, so birth, death, marriage records, criminal records, so the convict transportation records, court records, and institutional records, so the charitable institutional records, for example, as well as other public records, including newspapers and such like. And this is in order to build up the whole lives of pauper-emancipists. To give you an idea of a kind of typical pauper-emancipist, the population that we're looking at here, they were mostly male. And this is because 80% of those who were transported were male. So there was simply a sex imbalance in the colonies, in Van Diemen's Land in particular. And if they were male, they were usually unmarried. And again, this is partly because of that sex imbalance. If they were female, there was less of them and they were likely to be widowed. And so that feeds into that kind of life cycle approach of how they ended up in the charitable system. They were generally at least 55 years of age, but they were usually closer to 70 years of age. So we're talking about the latter end of their life cycle. And they, because of this, often had age-related illnesses. They were all born in Britain or Ireland. Now, some of them were convicted elsewhere in the empire, but they were originally, they were born in Britain or Ireland. And this is usually, in fact, the majority of the cases because they were soldiers who were court-martialed elsewhere in the empire and then transported to Van Diemen's Land. In the sample, of course, they were all former convicts because this was one of the criteria used to select this sample. And in fact, there wasn't much of a selection here because the majority of those who ended up in the charitable system were former convicts anyway. Of my whole sample, I only excluded 3 who were not former convicts. One of them arrived free as a free immigrant, and the other 2 I couldn't discern either way, so I had to exclude them, but the rest were former convicts. So that's the population that we're dealing with to give you an idea. So the poor, as we know, have been long linked with criminality. This is not a new thing. And we can see this in the way that legislation and policy have attempted and continue to attempt to target homeless and vagrant populations. But despite this, the poor were not, and indeed still are not, without their agency. And of course, we have to remember this. So, for example, institutional forms of charity were often utilized by the poor and vagrant as and when it was useful to them. So, for example, in England, this has been demonstrated by Tim Hitchcock's work, and in Tasmania, it's been demonstrated by Piper's work, the kind of utilization of charity as kind of makeshift economies. So, while there was a penalization of the charitable system, pauper-emancipists still managed to demonstrate their agency through choosing to use welfare as part of this economy of makeshift. And then in circumstances where that welfare support was unavailable or perhaps just plain undesirable, crime could then be a more attractive alternative, even in the face of possible punishment. And in terms of kind of being undesirable, so for example, in England, workhouses in terms of their diet and their conditions were often worse than prisons in the same period because prisons were more heavily regulated and inspected, as opposed to workhouses. So sometimes they were other alternatives. And indeed, crime then became an option for those who were thrown on to hard times through changes at the kind of macro level through the economy, which affected their ability to support themselves, and changes in their social circumstances across their life cycle. So for example, as touched on earlier, being widowed. So theft, begging, vagrancy, prostitution, as Heather Shaw's work has pointed out, were on a continuum between crime and poverty. Thus, there was no clear line between crime and poverty from an institutional or policy level, as already pointed out. And similarly then, there was not a clear line at the individual level either. So pauper-emancipists also saw this continuum as well. And this is why this research has taken the approach to investigate the institutional mechanisms, so within the penal and the charitable arenas, alongside the life courses of individual pauper-emancipists. So the focus will now beyond the offending of pauper-emancipists, which I identified through the police gazette and the conduct records from their conduct transportation records of my sample of pauper-emancipists. And the focus will be on only those crimes which were committed after servitude, so when they were free, emancipated, if you will, from the convict system. And looking at that offending, 40% of male pauper-emancipists in the sample committed at least one offence in freedom, and 39% of the females did. And so there is a significant number of pauper-emancipists then who committed offences during freedom. And so I wanted to take a closer look at that. To do that, I categorised the offending. And I did this relatively rudimentary, kind of straightforward 2 categories, and I will explain the reasoning for the categories in a minute, in order to kind of look at that offending in freedom of pauper-emancipists. The first was minor offending: vagrancy, begging, inability to support themselves, causing a nuisance on the streets, being idle and disorderly, using indecent language, and similar kind of offending. So those offences which either involve being visibly poor or nuisance within the kind of public space, essentially. And the second one is serious offending. Now, I'm open to a different term for this because I'm not comfortable with serious offending, but I need to differentiate it from minor offending, so I welcome views on this. But within this category, there was theft, no matter how petty, receiving, and assault in any form. And because of this, then, even very minor or petty theft has been categorised within the latter category, which I have tentatively called serious offending, as to differentiate it from minor offending. And the reasons for these 2 broad categories, though, nomenclature aside, the reason for separating them were twofold. One is that, contemporarily speaking, any form of theft was considered serious, even if motivated by need, which of course we might disagree with now, but contemporarily speaking, it would have been considered serious. Property crime was serious. Secondly, is that it was important for my purposes to separate theft offences, or crimes proper, if you will, related to from those related to individuals being a nuisance within the public street, and related to vagrancy and begging and so on. So I wanted to be able to separate them. But I would like to stress that these practices within the latter, serious offending, particularly those related to theft, and the majority of them were minor thefts, were on a continuum, as I kind of touched on earlier, and part of the makeshift economy of the poor. And this continuum will be kind of highlighted more when I look at a case study, which I'll introduce later on. But that aside, when categorized into minor and serious offending, for the males, the offending was more often minor offending than serious offending in these categories, but only slightly. So there was still a fair amount of serious offending. And for the females, the offending mirrors that of the males, but overall the offending was less prevalent. So unsurprisingly, females committed less offences than males, but the pattern was the same. And so, looking at the data at this level, there's certainly evidence to suggest that there was a targeting of pauper-emancipists as visible nuisances during their time of freedom. But there are also instances of crimes proper as well, so those that fitted into my second category of serious crime. So to understand this further, I wanted to put them into context, this offending within their life courses. So I wanted to look at their life courses and see where this offending was happening. So, as noted, the offending of pauper-emancipists were more often minor than serious, but there was still a significant amount of serious offending. But when looking at the life courses of the sample, what is evident quite quickly is that the offending categorized as serious, so the second category, drops off across the life course and reduces essentially. And so their status of freedom and the stage of their life course are important in understanding this offending. And in exploring the offending pattern across their life course, it is immediately evident that minor offences predominated in the latter part of the Pauper-Emancipists' lives. Now, this is not to say there were no thefts or assaults during freedom, or even past the point at which they entered the pauper system, but that largely their offending related to minor offences in which they were targeted for being public nuisances under such crimes as idle and disorderly and vagrancy and so on. And indeed, being found idle and disorderly was one of the most common, in fact, was the most common offence in later life for the Pauper-Emancipists. And I wanted to kind of demonstrate this and take it out of the abstract by illustrating an example of a life narrative from my sample. And I chose Catherine Deverell, I hope I am pronouncing that correctly. And she was deliberately chosen by myself because I wanted to choose someone who was not a low-level offender to demonstrate this. And Catherine committed quite a lot of offences. So the life of Catherine then. Pre-transportation, so back home in the UK, Catherine was born in Ireland, but she was convicted in Lancashire in England. So she obviously at some point migrated to England. And she was convicted in 1840 for receiving, and she was given the sentence of 10 years transportation. But this was not her first offence. She committed at least 2 previous theft offences, minor petty theft. And there is talk in her conduct record of other offences, but it's very vague. But it's likely that there were a few more offences as well, but all related to petty theft. She was 20 years of age and single when she was transported, so a young woman. When she arrived in the colony and during her time in the colony, she committed approximately 69 colonial offences. And this is a lot for female convicts. It's above average. So when she was under sentence, at first this offending included very low-level offending, such as disobedience of orders and disorderly conduct, offences which are known as status offences. They were offences that she could be convicted of because she was a convict and she wouldn't have been if she was a free person. So largely status offences. And she was given punishments, the usual punishments that would be expected. She was sent to the female factory, so a place of confinement for female convicts in Van Diemen's Land. And she was given hard labour or solitary confinement, respectively, for different offences. However, she was then convicted, she was committed for trial and convicted for stealing money and silver. Now, this was a serious offence, and she was one of the women who had her sentences extended. And this was relatively unusual for female convicts to have their sentences extended. She was actually retransported for 14 years for this offence. Essentially meant she had 14 years added on to her sentence. And it was unusual in female convicts, largely because they committed less serious offences than the males, though there are other arguments for why there were kind of gendered differences in punishment. But for our purposes, she was given 14 years extra on her sentence. And after this sentence, she committed relatively minor offences, such as disturbance in the jail, insubordination and absconding, all against status offences, although absconding was considered fairly serious offence, even though it was a status offence. And these again resulted in solitary confinement on bread and water, being kept in the female factory, given hard labour, and so on. So despite having, committed a serious offence, being retransported, she did marry. And this again relates to the sex imbalance in the colony. She had her choice on the marriage market. And she married in 1846 to a ticket of leave holder, James Deverell, and he was a labourer. And they had approximately 9 children, although Not all of them survived infancy because some of them had repeat names, so I think that some of them died, but it couldn't find the death certificate. So she did form a familiar life, and she was eventually assigned to her husband, which was not unusual. And this, though, does not seem to have prevented her from being brought to the attention of the authorities and being formally sanctioned. So she was reported for misconduct several times, for which she was given brief spells of solitary confinement and hard labour. When she was caught drunk the first time, so the first offence for drunkenness, she was discharged back to her husband, but she committed this offence on a number of occasions, and she was fined on the latter occasion. At this point, she had earned her ticket of leave, so she had more freedoms, but she committed similar offences repeatedly. And really what we have here in the time that she was a ticket of leave holder and into freedom were minor offending. There is one blip in 1853 where she was tried for robbing a man of promissory notes in a public house, but she was discharged, so she wasn't found guilty. But repeatedly she was brought up for drunkenness, which resulted, as I say, in more and more fines. She was also fined for obscene language, disturbing the peace, being incapable of taking care of herself. In 1858, she was found to be idle and disorderly without any visible means of subsistence, for which she was given 3 months imprisonment with hard labour. And she was repeatedly brought up for this offence and similar offences, such as being drunk and incapable. There was the odd offence such as begging alms, which threw in some variety, but largely she was caught for being idle and disorderly time and time again. Later in life, Catherine then re-entered the government institutions when she was admitted to the Launceston Benevolent Asylum in 1898. She was approximately 78 years of age, so an elderly woman by this point, and she died that year of senility within that institution. As well as learning about her familiar life through the civil records, we also learn about her employment through her death records in the institution. And Catherine is described and portrayed as a domestic. I'll come back to that in a moment. After freedom, essentially the point here is that she committed no serious offences, according to my categorisation, but she did commit minor offences, but quite a lot of them. And this illustrates how pauper-emancipists could be brought back into the convict system through the criminalisation of poverty. And evidently, despite having at least some intermittent work as a domestic servant, it's impossible to know how much, it was evidently not enough to sustain her economically. Offences such as idle and disorderly, begging alms, without visible means of support, drunk and incapable, were all offences related to the visible nuisance of the poor and the wish to kind of regulate urban public space. And there was a particular concern with controlling this population who were perceived as interfering with the public space through just their visible presence. However, as the population aged, they were also likely to end up in the charitable system rather than the jail. And this is shown where Catherine ended up dying within the charitable institution of Launceston. In a related but different process then, there was, as well as the criminalisation of poverty, there was the penalisation of the charitable system itself. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this due to time, but I wanted to add this in to show that the criminalisation of poverty and the penalisation of the charitable system kind of worked at the same time to control this population. And this was partly led by, so the penalisation of the charitable system was partly led by practical factors, such as there being an existing convict infrastructure and personnel to utilise from the convict transportation system, which was being dismantled. However, there was also a narrative of control and othering of pauper-emancipists, which are evident in the newspapers, which enable the process to happen with relatively little resistance. So while the mechanisms and policy arenas are different, they worked the penalisation of poverty, the criminalisation of the charitable system, they worked to achieve the same end, essentially, to control the visible poor who were positioned as problematic and a public nuisance. And of course, there's been a long-standing link argued to exist between the criminal justice system, the convict system in this case, and the welfare charitable system in the practice of the control of the so-called underclass as they were positioned. And indeed, there was also this close link in how they worked in practice as well between the criminal and the charitable institutions. So, for example, those breaching invalid regulations, so those within the charitable system, could be sent to prison. And this was always kind of held over them when they were in the charitable system, that if they didn't behave and follow the penal regulations that were put in place in the charitable system, they could actually just end up in prison. It was also possible for it to work the other way, where pauper-emancipists could be picked up for imprisonment and then transferred to the charitable institution. An example of this is Catherine Threshan, who was picked up for being idle and disorderly in 1877 when she was 77 years of age. And it was decided that she would be forwarded to the invalid depot. And this is probably because of that age. So essentially, there was generally concern over the convict past of paupers, which led to a belief that they needed to be controlled, just as they had been when they were convicts before they were freed. So current criminalisation of poverty and homelessness then is obviously not new. And in the Tasmanian context, there was the criminalisation of poverty itself through the bringing of the poor into the convict system, through attempts to control those visibly through the targeting of kind of misdemeanors such as idle and disorderly, vagrancy, and other visible nuisance related offending. And when looking across the whole life course, the number of serious offences committed within pauper-emancipist population unsurprisingly dropped off. Now, we would expect them to reduce because as we get older, we commit less crimes. However, what is more concerning here is the increase in minor offending related to vagrancy and non-maintenance. So this is particularly problematic given arguments which situate the cause of their inability to support themselves within the convict system itself. So the type of labour-intensive roles carried out during their sentence and in early years of freedom were not the kind of roles that they were able to continue in old age, nor had they been able to prepare for old age because of their time under sentence and the kind of menial, low-paid and sometimes intermittent work that they were able to carry out during freedom when they were able to actually work. Indeed, this is kind of another aspect which mirrors the way in which we respond to homelessness today. So Crisis, the activist charity, have criticised the current lack of attention on the causes of poverty and homelessness today. And rather, there's a concentration on the results of it. And the same was happening in Tasmania in the 19th century. Thank you very much for listening. I'm open to any questions or any discussion that anybody has to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. Very fascinating conversation about the historical continuities and the reproduction of this very important social crisis, social issue. I see that we have some comments, some observations and questions in the chat. So I'll just go straight there as a starting point for this conversation. And I'll just go through it from top to bottom. I noticed that Jessamy Carlson has asked, could you reframe the first grouping as antisocial behavior rather than minor, perhaps? I realize it comes with its own expectations.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the kind of language we would use today, isn't it? And as long as with explanation within the context that I'm talking about, I think it might work. Because when I was doing it, I knew when I was putting it on that minor offending I had less problematic, but serious offending I thought was really problematic. But I think that your idea of antisocial behavior could work with some explanation and background about it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And if you have written a question in the chat and you have a follow-up, please feel free to do that at the end. I'll go through. David Churchill has a comment. I'll go through on the categorization of offending. I wonder if impersonal personal offending might work better than minor major. It doesn't map perfectly onto offenses listed, example, receiving, but this tends to distinguish crimes with a personal victim, so theft and violence, and those without, so nuisance offenses. Regulatory crimes sometimes also used for impersonal offenses, which highlights that these are offenses over which public authorities, like the police, tend to take the lead in terms of the initial response to offending rather than victims. I'm not sure how you would respond to that, Emma.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, it might be, they wouldn't easily map onto impersonal and personal, but maybe I could break them up even further, the offending categories, and get particularly the serious one, because that would relate more to impersonal and personal. Regulatory crimes, that perhaps that could work as well. Well, these are all good ideas. I think regulatory crimes is kind of similar to the idea of status offences, where it was an offence because of your status rather than not, which is a common thing used in convict, in reference to convicts and their offences under sentence. So regulatory crimes as well could be useful. Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, Desmee, as well.
Thanks, guys. Rona Epstein,
Hello.
comment. Hello, Rona. Welcome. Thank you for joining today.
Hi.
So Rona says, thank you for bringing this very important issue that this continues today. And Rona, you talked about a recent criminal justice bill that penalizes.
Yes. Yes, I was reading it this morning. I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read it, but I have to say my jaw dropped open. It's quite, to me, beyond belief. Anybody found begging will get a note issued to them, and if they don't stop begging, the penalty is 1 month in prison. Anybody rough sleeping will get a note to say they must no longer sleep rough in that place, must remove all their belongings, and if they don't do this, they don't comply immediately, the penalty is 1 month in prison. I just found it incredible. How do you all react?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was referring to with the kind of adding into the criminal justice bill. Obviously, you have a more recent update on it, and it's pretty awful. I mean, it is the worst parts of the vagrancy bill, and perhaps even adding to it into a current bill. Yeah.
There's not one word of liaison and diversion, not one word of support. It's completely and entirely punitive. And where is this army of enforcement people who are going to go around issuing notices to all the people that are begging and sleeping rough? I mean, it's, you know, it's a fantasy world, but it's such a horrible one. It must tell us something about our society that the government believes this is the right thing to put forward, even if it's completely impractical.
It seems like a strange waste of resource to penalize, because I'm sure that it costs a tremendous amount of money when there are other structural issues that could be dealt with, that could be sorted for the just resolve the issue that's being penalized.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, I've just put it in the chat that I've been doing research for the last 3 years on antisocial behavior injunctions, which are dished out very easily for bad language, for being drunk. I mean, a lot of what we've been hearing, being idle, drunken, disorderly, and when they're breached, the penalty is up to 2 years in prison. And I've given you a link there to my article if you want to have a look at it. surprisingly long sentences have been imposed. I have one man, a Mr. Maguire, who was sentenced to 1 year imprisonment for begging. He begged on the London Road in Leicester, and Leicester County Court sent him to prison for 52 weeks. And a group of travellers had 14 months imposed on them for breach of an injunction for parking their caravan in a site that they'd bought, but which was in the green belt, so they weren't supposed to park the caravan or put hard standing there. 14 months is the equivalent, was given recently in Luton Crown Court for a man who killed somebody through drunken and dangerous driving. So that's how long 14 months in prison is in the criminal court. And here it's imposed on a group of travellers, some of whom were very vulnerable people, actually. One who was the mother of young children, for parking their caravan, and that is a contempt of court. If the court has said in an injunction, you may not park your caravan. Anyway, I've just put it there in the chat, and I think if you're interested in poverty and crime and punishment, you should you might like to have a look at it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I definitely will. I've got the link for when this goes down. I can have a look at it.
Anyway,
yeah,
thank you. Can I just say thank you to Emma, the speaker? It was very interesting.
Thank you, Rona. I think that's the kind of similar things happening where there's kind of this criminalization through the back door. So it's not, you know, they might not be convicted for being poor, but it's still happening in that kind of not that roundabout way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'll have a look at that, see if I can, and I'll update my criminal justice part as well. Thank you, Rona.
Thanks, Rona. We have a question from Tahani Algrani. She says, thank you, it was really interesting. And she wants to know how many case studies you have.
So my original sample, off the top of my head, was just under 1,000 in terms of the Pauper-Emancipists as a whole in the database, where I found all the former convicts who died in the charitable systems within the period that I was looking. And I then traced them back to see the where they were convicted from and what their crimes were, and put some basic information in for them. But to do the kind of whole life courses, such as the example that I gave with Catherine, I had to do some sampling. So I did all of the females, and then I matched to the number of males who I had to sample by essentially putting the database in chronological order and picking every other or wherever it was, so that I had a spread across time of those individuals. And I think in total, though don't quote me on it, it was 362 case studies in the end, equal number of male and females.
Well, thanks, Jess. Thanks, Emma. I was just going to say how many females, but you just beat me to it. So, because you know that I'm interested in that. Thanks for the talk, Emma. It was really interesting. And we'll speak more about it, because I'm really interested in how you did the you know, the evaluation, you know, your data sampling of this, because when we look at life course, obviously, like, you know, for girls, it's so difficult to follow them through. So I'll chat more with you about it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to, particularly with women, obviously marry and change a name, or they don't officially marry, but they change their name because of common law relationships. It can be a nightmare. The benefit here was that because they were convicts, they kept tabs on them, and because they ended up back in the government institutions, they referred back to where they came from, so their former names and stuff like that, so that you could match them with the convict convict status. So yeah, it's easier in Australia for that purposes than, for example, it would be in the UK in the same period.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma.
Thanks, Tahani. We have a question from Kira Malloy. Kira says, thanks so much for a fascinating talk, Emma. In terms of the charitable system, you mentioned demonization of paupers in the press at the time. I wonder, could you tell us more about this? For instance, what processes or forms of rhetoric were used to make these individuals into folk devils? Was there consensus among the press, or did any alternative voices seek to challenge these representations?
Yeah, good question. So they largely linked paupers with their emancipate status. So it was more of a kind of positioning them as former convicts as being the main problem, even though the vast majority of the population were either former convicts, or children of convicts. There was still this kind of narrative of them being former convicts and giving that kind of convict stain to the paupers. But also it was linked to finance within the economy as well, where the imperial government were, at the time that all this kind of really started, were trying to wean the Van Diemen's Land off their finances so that they would no longer pay for certain things, such as they would pay for convicts, but not those who would no longer under the convict system, for example. And so one of the first things to be taken away was the funding for those who were former convicts who could no longer subsist, right? So pauper-emancipists. And so when the colony themselves had to pay for that, then there was this rhetoric of them being a burden on the colony and that they were stretching the finances of the colony. And then obviously the usual thing about being a public nuisance and taking up space in urban environments. So it was a kind of combination. There was definitely dissenting voices, and they were kind of, it wasn't like all one way. There were some charitable institutions which or benevolent societies rather than institutions, that did kind of argue that they needed to be looked after and taken care of, and there was less of the demonization kind of narrative. And they kind of said that it doesn't matter in terms of morality what they did and that kind of narrative, but they still needed to be kind of taken care of. But their response to taking care of them was largely to institutionalize them within the charitable institution. And they thought that that was the best way to take care of the population. But they did think that it should be kind of less penal, but that that institutionalization was the answer. So there was definitely, it wasn't all one way, but after the financial weaning of the colony, it kind of got stepped up in the press and got worse.
Thanks for that. On the back of that last question from Kira, I'm always interested in the sort of ideas around intergenerational transmission of stigma, for instance. So to what extent did what happened to the parents, especially mothers, to what extent did this impact the way that their offspring? So for instance, your case study that she went on to marry and have children. So to what extent were those children brought into the system?
It's an interesting question. There's quite a lot written on convict stigma, or the convict stain as it's sometimes called, and there are differing opinions on it. But generally speaking, from my own research into juvenile convicts and these pauper-emancipists, largely the convict stain wasn't that intergenerational, because convictism was kind of so common, in that most of the colony had some were either convicts themselves, former convicts, or children of convicts, and it was kind of all married to a convict, so it was ever present. That the convict stain didn't interfere with their life chances. The only kind of exceptions were if they weren't then fulfilling what society wanted for them, like pauper-emancipists, where then the kind of idea of convictism and convict stain was brought out, and in terms of that was why they weren't kind of behaving in the way that they should. But in terms of generally around the population, it doesn't seem to have been a huge intergenerational issue. And in fact, within kind of the juvenile convicts that I looked at in my other research, they generally, as long as they kind of they didn't like move up in terms of social mobility or anything like that, but they just carried on in the kind of working class jobs that they would have had back home, and kind of had, you know, successful colonial lives in terms of males. And for females, it really seemed not to have mattered, because many of them were able to marry very early on in the colony, particularly in my juvenile female convicts, because by the time they finished their servitude, or during their servitude, all of them pretty much married. And they sometimes had their choice in terms of the marriage market. So in terms of having like permission to marry when they were under servitude, some of them made more than one kind of request to marry different men in order to, you know, get the best choice in the end. So there was, I think that it wasn't so much of an issue generally, except for where they weren't performing in the way that society wanted them, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I have because some of my research intersects with a sort of comparative method. I look at both the Canada and England, and this has a sort of specific logic, because there's a new world and an old world thinking and approach. So the new world thinking would be in the Canadian context, where there's a sense that there's an opportunity for transformation beyond the sort of class constructs that one would have experienced in the old world. So the experiences, it seemed, in the English context, where there's a sort of trajectory or lineage of based around class, which informed gender and racial relations. There's in my research, at least, there's more likelihood of the intergenerational transmission in the when it came to gender in absolute terms, or class in absolute terms, in the English context than in the Canadian context, where people would start off as in a lesser sort of working class role, and then you could find generations later people working in completely different, in a different social class altogether, except where it intersected with race, where it's a bit of a crapshoot there, where it's a 50-50 chance. I think I'm throwing that out there because my math is terrible, but of social mobility or not, or of the trauma of that's transmission of stigma. So there's another, it looks like there's another comment in the chat. Jessamy again says, it comes up in other areas of government too, this return to Victorian approaches to crime, not only the demonization of homelessness. We've seen chain gangs proposed in 2021, then PM's words, with no thought, presumably, for the history of that term. He probably doesn't know anything about history though. And secure schools introduced as a new innovative approach to youth custody in 2022, as just two examples. Jessamy, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
I'm just interested that it's this return to these sort of ways, I think, that we thought were more or less gone from the past, are now being repeated back to us. As I say, the youth custody one really, like, personally gets my goat, because I don't consider that something we stopped using in 1973 because it hadn't worked for 150 years can be framed as either new or revolutionary, but here we are all the same. And yeah, it just seems to be, it's really, it was quite interesting as a historian, particularly when Johnson made that chain gangs proposal. It's like, okay, so what next? What's going to, and then there was a conversation, I think, in Parliament about whether corporal punishment should be brought back as another attempt, particularly I think in the context of juvenile crime, but it may have just been crime in general. And there were comments just yesterday, I think it was Warwickshire County Council, it was in various of the papers and the various news channels this morning, about it was in the context of a local authority councillor talking about the rise in children with additional needs, and questioning why there wasn't more scope for institutional care of these children. And like, it's again, like, did the last 50 years just not happen? Have we woken up in some horrendous kind of repetition of stuff we thought was long gone in terms of corporate and government approach to things?
Yeah, I mean, the corporal punishment, I mean, that's what I'm looking at when I'm looking at reformatory schools of research that I just started now, and I've been going through all the parliamentary reports over time like the continuation of like the way that they like position corporal punishment, or however they term it, over time. Not a lot changes, unfortunately. And also in terms of like returning to things that we've done before, I think with convict transportation, I mean, is it that dissimilar from the kind of Rwanda scheme of sending someone to another country without their choice? I mean, yeah.
Drop me a line about the corporal punishment thing, because I was looking at something just this afternoon where the Home Office and the Approved School Association are actually saying there's returning to corporal punishment won't help our cause. Like, we've demonstrated that it doesn't work, and that was in the 60s. So drop me a line and I'll give you the document reference for that, because I thought that was an interesting kind of step away from something. So, you know, it's the 1960s now, we've moved away from these kind of draconian approaches, things like, no, wait, no, it turns out we're going back to them.
Yeah, no, I definitely will. So I think your research kind of starts at the Approved School, doesn't it? Whereas mine stops there. So yeah, definitely need to talk.
Yeah, this is a real back to the future conversation, isn't it? When you brought in sending people to Rwanda, and you were talking about transportation in the 1840s. It's really hard to believe, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. When they, yeah, I mean, this, and they did that bet, didn't they? When the other day, £1,000 over whether he'll get it done before the election.
Yeah.
Just to say here that this is something that it's interesting, because these practices, we can be led to believe that they went away, but I think that that a more nuanced way is to say that they went underground. So the idea of transportation manifested or reformed itself in deportations, for instance. So the idea that if, I know for sure in the Canadian context that if you are not born in Canada, but even if you're a citizen, and you are from elsewhere, but you were naturalized, that an option after a crime has been committed is deportation. And this is despite whether or not you were, I mean, a sociologist would say that whatever this person has done was sort of cultivated in the Canadian context and not wherever it is that they were deported to. But like, there was a proposal by David Cameron, I think it was 2012, about building supermax prisons in Jamaica, so that Jamaica would become like another penal colony, because it was seen as the solution for, in the context of the racialization of crime, where a multitude of young people or racialized peoples from that context were being penalized, incarcerated. And the idea was that Britain doesn't want to bear the burden of this. So the whole idea of transportation from the interwar period onwards, we see transportation being, deportation being an option for when problems arose as a sort of solution to to mostly racialized populations from the colonies. So it never really went away. It just reformatted, and now it's come back in that sort of more major sense of transportation.
Yeah, I guess more obviously and more publicly than before. But yeah.
I have some people had to head off. And they send their apologies, Leah, Eleanor, and Kira. I just want to say thank you very much. Do you guys have any other questions amongst those who remain?
I just wanted to say, when we were having this conversation now about the Rwanda, it feeds into a lot of the dehumanization as well of those in poverty, links to race as well. I think we need to engage with this again. You know, these conservative policies, very much so, you know, at the time in the 1850s when they brought in the reformatory and the industrial schools, the same sort of ideas were being peddled then around race. You know, these ideas obviously, which are not, we don't associate with things like, you know, survival of the fittest and these kind of conversations. It seems very strange that we have this type of government that they, you know, this is the kind of rhetoric and language that we're hearing again, but in a more sanitized way, in which class is definitely obviously race as well. When we think about the Rwanda, So I mean that's just something I was thinking about before with the homeless as well. To actually put a homeless person in prison, it works out around 48,000, if not more, a year. To send someone to prison, yeah, the logical thing of housing them in a hostel, which would be a fraction of that price, it's like they will not do it. They will not go down that road. I just find it really interesting that we, in my discussions as well on reformatory industrial schools, that we're coming round with what Jessamy said. They're pitting it as something new, but it's not new at all. It's 150-year-old ideologies.
Yeah, and
It's interesting. Sorry, Emma.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's interesting because we also see on the flip side that when they want to make a step to look after the welfare of homeless people, they can do it. We saw this during COVID.
Literally what I was going to say.
Yeah, they strategically took as many homeless people into safekeeping as they could, and they do it in London as well. So I mean, I assume they do it in other cities, but we had a run of -8 temperatures, which appreciate outside of Britain isn't actually that cold, but for here it is very cold. And as part of that, my mum, who lives in the West Country, rang me and said, "Oh, I see they've initiated that policy where they're kind enough to take people off the street." Like, yeah, because it's -8 and they're gonna die of hypothermia. And like the idea that was some kind of state kindness rather than like the bare bones of basic human decency, I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, no, I was literally going to make the same point. A dissertation student of mine focused on what they did during COVID to get people, homeless people off the streets, and how they would kind of try and take learnings from it to do stuff later on, but then haven't really done it mostly. But obviously have the ability to do it. I appreciate that in the long term it will cost more and what have you, but there's obviously an ability to do it, and they know what needs to be done, but an unwillingness.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if it actually would cost more though, given the consequent costs around, if you're leaving someone on the streets in the cold and the damp and their health continues to suffer as a result, on top of the additional coping mechanisms they might undertake in order to just survive being on the street. Like, in the long run, does it actually cost more rather than looking after people properly?
True. And as what Tanya was saying about the cost of putting them in prison, it's obviously a lot of money. So, and also just having proper social structural things in place, which is what crisis are fighting to have done, instead of responding as we are to the aftermath.
Yeah, I'm convinced that the supportive approach would cost less than the punitive one.
I think this is part of the resistance to restorative justice, because restorative justice would take both the individual and the structures into consideration in deciding on policy, so that when you're trying to treat something, you're not trying to cure the symptom rather than the root causes. So the idea, okay, at the outset, taking care of the individual homeless people, that would require huge investment, but the structural things, these are, even if we think about it in these terms, in utilitarian terms, and say that this is a waste of human resources, this is a waste of human potential, this is a waste of the extent to which our society could benefit from each other, and often than not, sometimes if you don't have the family support, you have one thread that's unraveling, and then because there's no one there to support you, it unravels all the way, and then you fall all the way down through the cracks. And as a final point, I remember reading, I don't know if you guys have read this, that ethnography by George Orwell, Down and Out in, is it Paris and London?
Yeah, Paris and London.
Yeah, where he lives amongst the working classes, and you get a real sense that there's that poverty itself is considered to be a sin, because there is something about the way it's rationalized and normalized, the way that the working classes who are working, they're working, they're not idle, but the thing that tends to be the focus is the drunkenness, that they need something to sort of to treat their circumstance, and they turn to alcohol. And the part about their hard work is ignored, and the focus is on their delinquency, and their delinquency is seen as a gateway to the greater dangerousness of crime. And like in both the Parisian and the London setting, you get a real sense that there's a real moral imperative embedded with the way we respond to people who need support. That if the moment you ask for support, then you've already failed and you're already useless to us. So you may as well just step aside and be prepared to be wiped off or written off altogether. So yeah.
Yes,
Interesting research.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a great book. It's a great read for anyone who's not read it.
Yeah, it's because it is about how the past is replicated, isn't it? The way that we
Absolutely.
like it's still happening. It has still happening. Yeah. Okay, guys. Do you have any other questions for Emma today? Emma,
No, thank you, Emma.
thank you very much, Emma. And thank you all for your participation, for your attendance, and for your questions. Emma, I know that the chat is saved.
I've just copied and pasted it. So I'm just in case, because I want to make sure I have all the comments.
Yeah, it's definitely saved because of the recording. I think we can also get a transcript. I think you can also transcribe or something for brevity's sake. But if there are no further questions, I'll say thank you to everyone. Thanks for your suggestions and all. And hopefully see you in the next session, which is on the 6th of March. All right.
Thank you for
Thanks,
organizing.
Emma. Thanks, Esme.
Thanks for your questions.
No problem. No problem.
Cheers.
Have a nice evening.
Bye. Bye.